Okay, looks like everyone is here now. So, welcome. My name is Anastasia, and I'm the Director of Programs here at BC Tech. With most of us working from home, I would like to acknowledge that we are grateful to be gathered on Indigenous land, regardless of where you are joining us from. At my home in Vancouver, I am grateful to be on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. For those of you who are not familiar with us yet, BC Tech is dedicated to two things: making BC the best place to grow and scale a technology company, and advancing technology as an engine for growth in every company. I wanted to let you know why we are doing this program. I am sure I do not need to tell you that COVID-19 has impacted the supply chain across the globe. We have already been helping to get BC companies back on track, connecting over 200 small, medium-sized businesses with mentors and advisors. In doing that, they can adapt and position themselves for future growth and successes. But we wanted to do more. We want to give you the resources that you need to grow and scale your businesses and set the stage for success. This would be through access to subject matter experts like Eddan, Katz, and Dr. Bethany Edmonds today, one-on-one with deep dive experts that you and I have discussed personally, as well as the financial resources to onboard the expert that you need to better use AI and machine learning at your company. Before we begin, I do want to extend our thanks to our partner Scale AI in Montreal. Canada's AI supercluster shares the same goal as BC Tech to address the issues in our supply chain and provides the funding to make this program possible. Scale AI is the hub of Canada's AI ecosystem, offering funding, expert guidance, and a community of like-minded peers for artificial intelligence projects and training. I also wanted to thank Deloitte for being a community champion for HyperScale AI. And last but not least, to Rob Goring, who many of you have met, our program advisor. I would like now to go briefly over the HyperScale AI programming before we continue with our fireside chat. I promise it wouldn't take more than 5 minutes. Lauren, would you do the slides? Next one. So BC Tech is the voice of the BC technology economy. And next, currently the sector employs 164,000 people at the time of counting, and we believe that we're adding over 7,000 jobs a year. Next. But there is a challenge within our ecosystem. In order to be the top 10 companies in BC, a company needs to only employ 50 people. As a comparison, in California, that would be 500 people. We have a lot of work to do, but we can change that. Next. This is why we're doing HyperScale AI. Next. In terms of program overview, this program is delivered through a number of activities designed to grow your business by expanding access to knowledge, customer, and talent. Next. This is where you're going to get your expert on artificial intelligence, machine learning, supply chains, IP protection, as well as fundraising in order to fund your business. Next. Access to customers means that BC Tech will match industrial customers with AI supply chain solution providers for business matchmaking and collaboration at a unique collision day. You'll hear more about this from me next year. Next. Access to talent. Take advantage of funding to access experienced consultants to fill the skills gap at your business that go beyond what mentorship can do. Next. In terms of the time commitment, you and I have gone over this. Essentially, the program runs from December 2020 until the end of May next year. There will be monthly virtual sessions which will run approximately between 1 and 2 hours. And then depending on your needs for the deep dive, we can discuss what the hours would look like for you and members of your team. Next. Next. This is the schedule overview for the next 6 months. This will be emailed to you as well, so no need to worry about that. And for today, as you know, next slide, Lauren, we have our conversation on ethical AI. And next month, we will talk about building your AI team with Shifani Podan. Next. Perfect. Okay, now that we have covered the housekeeping side of the program, I am very pleased to kick off our fireside chat this afternoon. Please use the chat function throughout the conversation to ask your questions or wait for the Q&A portion. Your moderator for this fireside chat is a well-known thought leader in Canada's AI community. Dr. Bethany Edmonds is a recognized leader in computer science and STEM education in North America. She has a PhD in computer science with a specialization in AI and is currently a teaching professor and director of computer science at the Northeastern University Vancouver campus. Welcome, Dr. Bethany Edmonds. So glad to have you with us today. And joining us to speak on ethical AI is Eddan Katz, project lead on digital protocol networks at the World Economic Forum. He facilitates the norm-setting processes and dissemination of the protocols advanced by the projects at the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. He has previously served as the International Affairs Director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where he worked on advocacy initiatives at international multi-stakeholder decision-making bodies in the areas of cybercrime, data privacy, intellectual property, and freedom of expression. He was also the first executive director of the Information Society Project at Yale Law School, where he taught cyber law and founded the Access to Knowledge Initiative. Eddan, thank you so much. We're so happy to have you with us.
Thank you.
And Dr. Edmonds, over to you.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. So before we get really into the meat of it, I'd really first like to ask, why should we be ethical? So before we talk about how and all of that, like what is the why? Why should we, besides, you know?
Are you asking me or the other participants?
I
would start with well, in addition to the fact that Santa knows if you've been naughty or nice, and you may or may not get presents as a result. In addition to that, in the more science-based world, I think there's something about technology in particular. I mean, however you want to fall on ethical obligations of one person to another. One point that's true is that technologies have created a distance between the action and the outcome. And so further and further, if you think of an old technology like a hammer, the hammer directly to the nail. Once you have a large mechanical system, there's many parts in between. And with complicated networks, there are many, many layers. And so it gets diffused. But still, there is this notion of responsibility, and I think there is an imperative for it. Continuing on to where we will go, connected to responsibility, coming at this from law, is liability. So responsibility could also then mean that you're on the hook for something going wrong, or having not completed something as it ought to have been, and with consequences you didn't really anticipate. But I think it's actually an exciting moment where I would describe ethics differently in popular culture. I think people are much more aware of the relationship between them and the whole world now than they've been in a long time. People have said this when we had a relationship with the whole world when thinking about nuclear weapons and the whole planet in danger, climate change. We all understand that we're in it together and we have to act now. Everyone's aware that there is some obligation. You need to wear masks. That's part of how we're going to get through this. So there's this notion of shared responsibility, and I think it's accentuated even now during this time. And so I think the real answer is that we just because technologies have furthered and made less visible the functions of how things work, doesn't mean that people are off the hook for the responsibility they have over outcomes and how things are created.
So if it's something that we've been thinking about for a long time, and since the hammer, How is it any different? How does AI, and when we talk about responsibility and ethics, how does it change from being regular software or regular technology? And why is the conversation different when we're talking about artificial intelligence versus any other software?
Well, for one, it's a good question. It's one that should be repeated because I think you do have to sift through a lot of the hype, and I think AI is being described. That term gets used to describe a wide range of things. So I think what is critical from a policy point of view, for one, is this unintended consequences. It was once said that there's the known knowns, the known unknowns, and then the most complicated are the unknown unknowns, the things we don't even know that we don't know. And we're at that stage with AI, and that we just really can't anticipate how it may go. And so that's one crucial difference in having to think through things that you really don't know the consequences of it, and not just because it's complicated, but because of the evolutionary aspect and the modified and the learning aspect of AI, so that it changes from the minute it's engaged, and over time takes the data that is inputted and evolves over time and has its own vector. So there's aspects of not knowing where this tool will go, what it will do. And we've had examples of how it can go wrong in bias, in other kinds of discrimination, and in accuracy. And so I think that those are the beginning. That there are all sorts of nuances as well, but overall, I think it's not knowing where this is going, and having to make sure that we understand all the different layer points in between.
So when we're talking about that, and you mentioned bias before, but what exactly are the ethical concerns that we're talking about?
So I'm sure everyone's familiar and has thought about, or at least read about, your privacy. And I think I'm jealous of you Canadians. I think your government's a little more thorough about the matter, but never mind. I think one thing, if data is the fuel, or however when people want to term it, then it's really crucial that that data doesn't get misused, how it relates about yourself, and the kinds of uh, uh, in regards to data that sometimes has high sensitivity, such as medical data or financial data that could lead to serious consequences. So privacy is one. Another thing is connected to an aspect of what I was talking about, the continuous evolution of the technology, is a need to constantly do risk assessment, not in the way that it used to be at one point, but continually throughout as it evolves and it changes. I think that some of the ethical concerns that we've tried to discuss include the ability, you use the phrase access to knowledge, that the knowledge be sustainable within the community, that it be local, that there be domestic growth, and that it not just be about foreign direct investment, but it'd be about that people have control over their own work, and aren't ceding all of their knowledge to someone else. There is diversity is come to the fore, in particular with AI, because of the fact that it depends on the accuracy. So if a non-diverse set of data is inputted, the outcome will be relevant mostly and perhaps only to that population and not to others. And so it perpetuates the kind of invisibility that exists, and that we actually, as the panel started, pointed out about the indigenous land, and hoping not in this new era to perpetuate and in fact worsen the problem by baking it in to the algorithm.
So is there just one set of ethical rules that we can start following? Like, is there something that there have been, what I think we figured out, like hundreds of pledges saying we're all going to be ethical. So is there a way that we can just say, okay, here are the guidelines that we have to follow and that an organization needs to follow, and then just move forward?
Yeah, it would be great if it were that easy. And we did talk earlier. I mentioned that according to research that this colleague of mine at Stanford's done, there are over 500 sets of AI ethics principles and initiatives. That's counting it very broadly, not just company declarations or laws or the OECD, but also smaller coalitions, academic institutions, etc. So everyone is now, this is a concern, and part of it is because some of the laws that we have don't really cover some of these implications, and we have to look a little bit more broadly than how the law covers it. Um, I think um, when when creating laws, and especially treaties in the international law context, in the past, it was really dependent on a centralized area, perhaps Geneva or Brussels, where things went through the UN system. And I think that we're in an era where the UN system has greatly weakened, and the U.S. during this recent period has also relinquished its role in international policy leadership. Perhaps that will return, but the status now is of a much more fragmented system, and so um, creating regions where the norms take shape is what we're going for. That is what the work that I've been doing at the World Economic Forum is focused on, helping shape the norms that will become the foundation for the laws eventually.
And in that work, you've co-authored AI procurement in a box. Can you tell us what that is?
Yes. Before you get too excited, it's like 500 pages with a bunch of different documents in it. What it is, to put it briefly, is a way for government procurement officials to guide themselves through a set of recommendations through the process of reaching out to vendors in the RFP process and making sure that the questions asked and the process used allows for and enables more ethical use and incorporation of AI. Now, around that, there are all sorts of considerations. Like I said, there's different areas of law, and different laws take shape differently in different places, which is something top of mind for us. So the way we did it was we started with the partner in the UK, the Office of AI, and co-designed this set of recommendations, a set of 10 principles. We were very careful to make them cumulative. I would say that, you could probably count most of these as data policy and or AI, and just a few of them as just AI. But together, talking with government procurement officials in the private sector seeking to sell to government, what the problems were with the procurement process, and from that started developing these principles. And then, as all of our projects are, in a multi-stakeholder community, bringing people from civil society, from the private sector and different industries, different levels of government, and academia together to build consensus and to find some agreement on what this should look like. And that's the source of the World Economic Forum's authority. The World Economic Forum does not have an army, nor the ability to put anyone in prison. But the influence and the authority of consensus is what it's run on. So after actually piloting it with a real RFP in the UK with the Department of Defense, we then tried it in the United Arab Emirates with the Dubai Electricity and Water Authority, a partner of ours, and see how it worked there, and in Bahrain. And now we're talking, we've had inquiries from Chile, Argentina, and even the Department of Defense. We gave a workshop last week to the Department of Defense, and in terms of its impact on the whole industry, I think the Department of Defense probably represents more spending on weapons, for ill or worse, than all the other countries combined, and maybe even going back some years. So being able to impact the way that they purchase, make their purchases in AI, hopefully will have all the ripple effects that will become the standards by which by which companies have to take care of and disclose and deal with their data.
So I just heard that we have to follow our ethics from the DoD. That's a bit.
No, that is not what I said, but okay. Yeah.
So that sounds like a really interesting process, trying to get governments and software companies and universities to work together and come to some sort of agreement. In that, was there something that you heard that was kind of throughout all of that, of here's a concern that I have, here's something that we need to be aware of, like the thing that everybody said, if there was one thing or three things that we have to watch out for that's really dangerous, what would you say that would be?
I think most commonly in regards to the topics we're talking about, and what is of concern here is data integrity, to make sure the data is clean, that the quality is good, that the metadata is thorough, and that's really important in all of our so much of what is taking shape in policy is dependent on the databases and the data that comes from it. So I think data integrity is a huge part. But I think from the procurement side, it was very interesting and new to me to think about the fact that they felt like many of them, government procurement officials, felt like they were always being asked to purchase a solution rather than solve a problem. And this actually became a theme that was repeated throughout, that our first recommendation ended up being focus on solving a problem rather than choosing a solution. And I think that is, I think that actually applies a lot to AI. Like, there are some people who think, just throw AI at it and it'll make it better. Well, that's not the case. And it should be deliberative, and it should be purposeful, and there should be a reason for why you're using this algorithm or that, or this database or the other.
So in that, I guess what I've found in my conversations, especially with using big terms like artificial intelligence, which don't necessarily mean very much, how does an organization, as they're going to procure something, get enough information about what they're trying to get, right? The software that they're trying to get or to incorporate. Sometimes there's maybe it's a language gap, or there's, right, if you're not talking about the solution but instead talking about AI, how do you break that down so that you can make sure that what you're getting is actually what you need?
Well, let me clarify that not the solution versus AI, but that the AI as a solution is not the focus, but rather the problem being hunger or unemployment. So focus on how do we solve this particular sub-issue of healthcare, and then see how the AI can be connected to that and where it's useful. The way that we've gone about our projects actually is focusing very closely on the use cases, because in generalities, like I said, there's over 500 sets of principles throughout the world. There's 60 national AI strategies. Our focus, and I don't think there are very many others, is on implementing and finding ways where this can actually be put from principles to practice. And so that, I think, is a key part in different contexts in which that happens, one of which is in the boardroom. So the board and the kinds of responsibility that the board has for a corporation, we have the board toolkit, which was developed in partnership with BBVA, the bank out of Spain, and piloted in Colombia and now in places around the world. So now that project is turning into the C-suite toolkit. So what executives need to know. It is interesting how you're saying so often, and even in sophisticated organizations, starting out by trying to see what they should do about the AI. The first step was, okay, where do we use AI? In every place. Like, we don't even know. We have not inventoried. We do not catalog. There's no way to describe how you would trace AI in our system. So just doing that first has been one part. But we also tried as much as we could to avoid getting into definitions of what AI is, or what the right ethics are. The ethics that we were focusing on was process rather than normative values. Though there are some, including diversity, that could be called both a process and a value. There was a question.
Yeah. So before we get to the question, you're just talking about context, and given that Scale AI is helping support this, I'm wondering how AI, and especially AI ethics, applies to supply chain, and how do they actually relate to each other?
So I think, thank you for leading to it. It is really about the data. And so since it is so significant where the data comes from and how it's used and what population it's being used from, I think that is both complication and obstacles, but it's also, I think, an opportunity to develop. And with our government procurement project, part of the point is to develop local industry, local knowledge that is, as our recognition is that there is always customization that needs to take place with these solutions, allows for the entry rather than the inviting multinationals and big corporate players to allow a smaller industry to thrive. And it's relevant because it started to become a matter of market differentiation. It's the big disasters haven't yet come, but there's been a lot of controversies. And it is, in terms of how I started talking about liability, it is much more worth your while to go through and be a little more methodical about your data than worry about a multi-million-dollar lawsuit on the other end for something that you didn't really intend or anticipate.
So what are some things that the companies can do when thinking about this to ensure the integrity, or make sure that as you're going through the process of data collection and data manipulation, that we really think about the possible outcomes, the negative outcomes that might come through improper usage?
Yeah, so I mean, there are several steps to that. And small companies, as I know well, having watched the space for a while, the first people that startups hire are not the lawyers and the policy people, because they have to build something first, right? So those people come a bunch later, and in fact, sometimes later than they should, but that's the case. So some of our projects are based on, there's one called the responsible use of technology, and it's led by some companies of what kinds of questions do you need to ask during the product development process? What kinds of things should the engineers take into account? What kinds of things should the marketing department be aware of, the legal and otherwise? And I think some of those, setting up those processes in a very deliberate way from the beginning, is much more worthwhile. And we're now at a point, and I see it often enough, and there's enough momentum behind it, both at universities and at companies, that engineers are asked to and being required to think in addition to being able to design something, but also think about the ethical implications, at least when able to consult with other people with perspectives together, that these outcomes are important enough to avoid, that getting the right expertise makes sense. And we're trying to make it much easier and less expensive by having these toolbox things that you could use. It's not the be all end all. I think you probably would want assistance in implementing it, but it's a huge start, and we're hoping that there's a industry that can arise around implementing it, both in nonprofit and consulting firms that help implement it. So that's how we're thinking about it. We also think that by publishing the ethical frameworks in different particular technologies. I was talking about our general frameworks, but we also have a project on facial recognition. We have a project on healthcare chatbots. And within these industries, being able to articulate the most relevant and uniquely situated things to consider, hopefully would become more relevant to companies rather than this big abstract set of ethics that everyone should follow, but may not necessarily have to do with your business.
So when trying to operationalize in these seem like very different contexts, how would an organization go about, or what should an organization think about in either building it into their process or in figuring out who to hire? Like how it feels like a lot to go from I want to be ethical in this to, okay, engineer, think about this, right? It feels like, is it best to build it into a process, or I guess it's a lot easier to say it and it's a lot harder to do it. And so how would you operationalize it?
Yeah, no, so the operationalizing both is, I understand your question, not only, to actually be effective, but also accountable. So that it's meaningful and not just empty words. So yeah, some of it is structural in terms of making sure that different departments talk to each other. I think one thing that we found is often that different parts of the organization are working at cross purposes. But some of the recommendations that we've given really have to do with focusing on the objective and making sure that the public benefit is in mind when it comes to government work, but also that not using more data than you need. Sometimes people, a lot of internet companies and have kind of hoard data and use a whole lot more than they actually need, and that ends up actually making it more complicated and greater exposure to liability than if they were to ignore it. I think one thing we've emphasized that is a part of it are diverse multidisciplinary teams. And we mean that in addition to culturally, which we do mean, we also mean in terms of discipline, and included in that, and this isn't just to help give my friends jobs, but there's a role for an ethicist now in companies. They're hiring in lots of places, and I think it reveals that there's different kinds of ways of thinking that need to come together in order to help solve these complicated problems. And generally, transparency is would be the shorter answer to your question in regards to accountability, and that it should be approached in every stage to think about how transparency can be achieved, and you're better off having more robust transparency in the long run. It actually is harder and sometimes requires more work to be more revealing about what you're doing, but it is worth your while in the long run. And some of that is through different mechanisms and transparency norms, but also there are different tests. And the one that is, I think, the most interesting one came out of Canada, the algorithmic assessment, and being able to actually describe in terms of transparencies, not just show what the code is, because that may not actually be meaningful. That may not tell you what's going on and how decisions are made, but the explainability to explain how this works and how this functions. So that's a lot to go through, but it really is, I would say, ensuring transparency and paying attention to diversity and focusing on the objective would be the summary of that.
You've mentioned accountability a few times, and I'm just so, and you talked about the Canadian government. They did the algorithmic impact assessment, and they've just put out recommendations for increasing PIPEDA, the privacy laws, to expand to artificial intelligence. But do you think that this is going to be a thing that regulators are going to be, it's going to come down to legal accountability, or do you think it's going to go through procurement first, and who's going to drive this? Is it
the
government?
Yeah. In some places, it will be governments that lead. Canada being one of those places. France being another. It seems at this point, from just our partners, this isn't comprehensive, but New Zealand being another. But the solutions that we're focused on, not just because of some of us having grown up with an American point of view, but there's all sorts of places where governance happens. And like I said, in the boardroom, there's responsibility on the part of the boardroom. There's responsibility of the C-suite, the procurement workers. There's responsibility for the social workers who get their knowledge from chatbots and how they relay them to rural patients, like the one that is in the example in our Rwanda chatbots reset project. And so the point of accountability, I think there's several different aspects to it, but the ability to demonstrate what you've done and show it on a regular basis and do it. I think the existence of third parties, whether or not there actually is an audit process or some kind of continued review, is important to that. I think companies do prefer that some of the places where we're helping shape these norms that would be more finely tailored to their business would be preferable than having to address it once it comes to legislation that may be more restrictive than is necessary for your particular business. And so you've already thought about it before the regulation comes down.
So I think that leads into Rob's question. So as discussed, this is a big topic, and most early stage companies will need to follow a crawl, walk, run approach to make this successful. So what is the type or level of internal and external oversight that an early stage company should pursue at the beginning of their ethical AI implementation process?
I think that documentation, I think, is one thing that I'm describing throughout, and documentation not also in the sense of not just what took place, but explaining how it took place. So I think really keeping track of that, but also keeping track of the lines of communication to make sure that decisions are made with the input of the different entities. It may be a small company, but there still are different perspectives along the way. And in terms of, I mean, external oversight, you're gonna everyone's already had to put out a privacy policy and put together some terms of service and these kinds of things, and you may have copied it and pasted it from somewhere else, which is what happens more often than not. But that's the beginning of the route, and we anticipate that there will be the kind of statements about your algorithms that will be expected down the line. So I think getting in the habit of the documentation and the culture of transparency is the best part. And I'm not saying hire a lawyer or policy person, because that really doesn't make sense for certain size companies. But being aware of what the law is useful, and more there are easier ways to learn about what the law is. I know that the privacy commissioner in Canada, there's a lot more educational tools that help make it palatable, the context of privacy, rather than having to look at these big small letter agreements. So I would learn and start becoming familiar and take seriously what the terms of service and privacy policy says, because someday you may actually have to refer to it.
Right now, do consumers expect to know or be told if artificial intelligence is in the process that they're using?
I think so. Part of discussions that we've had include the necessity of disclosing when it's an AI. So, for example, when you have chatbots, you'll notice that more and more there is notice that it's a chatbot. I mean, I could before you've got someone aggravated, yelling at their computer because the chatbot won't listen and doesn't understand their needs. It might be worthwhile to understand that empathy is a unique human trait, and that this doesn't necessarily come from that. And most importantly, that decisions. I think the fact that decisions are made in this, remote way is what is most difficult. I think for consumers to understand the um, the smart speaker that's in your home that's very, very practical and can do all sorts of things. It also is, exposure to lots of surveillance and tracking and profiling over time. Things that, even those of us who think like, oh, I'm not doing anything wrong, you'd be surprised, right? Once you go under deep scrutiny and have access to everything. So the kind of remoteness of it, I think there's one thing in the government procurement example that brought it home: the ability to appeal a decision, right? So what if an AI system is part of the calculation of whether someone gets their unemployment insurance or access to housing or citizenship or whatever it is? If there's a algorithm that decided it, the way that administrative law works, both in the US and Canada and most of the world, is that the person has the ability to appeal. This decision was made, but I don't think it's right. Show me why, how it was done. And if it's arbitrary, then it is not permissible for it to be done that way. And in the case of algorithms, if you were to ask, how did you make this decision in this particular context? I don't think there would be an answer. There are people who are more technically inclined than me, but as far as I've been, it has been explained to me is that the particular instance, you would not be able to isolate and be able to explain the reasons for those decisions. And so now you've got that aspect that I think is the most frustrating, the shake your hand at the cloud thing of like, you don't know who's deciding and what's happening and why. And I think that's part of the reason that it's a good idea to disclose. I think that the ambiguity, it's better to say it up front. This is a chatbot that's going to make it more efficient. When there is a problem that requires human intervention, this is set up so that it can do that. But we're all going to have to employ some automated systems in order to get over the overwhelming demands of things.
So I in my workshops, I often do parse out the automation versus the learning, because they're not, we all often assume that something's learning on its own and it's acting on its own. Is there anything in that, any sort of recommendation in terms of whether humans should still be part of the process, how much they should be? Is that something that comes up in your conversations?
It is, and this is partly where I actually came at all these issues originally from philosophy, and the question of can computers think was a hot one. I would isolate it to two main features of human nature. I think the ability for empathy is something that we should defend as a human thing. When it's described that different systems have empathy, it turns out that's not what I would describe as empathy. I heard one insurance company claim that they had an empathy engine where it was just basically deciding whether or not people were lying about whether there was an accident or how it took place. That's different than empathy, and I think it's important to understand the difference. I was just getting at judgment. So those are the two I focus on. If in whatever abstract interactions and transactions that take place, those that involve empathy and human judgment are ones that we should tread carefully on and make sure we think through where the human in the loop should be, what the limits of how it's implemented, and other kinds of concerns.
So there's a question here. Do you have an example of an early stage company being able to incorporate ethics of AI into their working? And I do know from our Cascadia commitment group that Skyhive, I don't know if they'd be considered still early stage. I know that they try really hard. to put AI ethics at the front of what they're doing. But do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we've had different examples, many of which are through the companies that are helping other companies. So the companies that the organization Splunk is advising, I would look at Splunk and what they're doing. There's a lot of stuff from Canada, in particular, the stuff that I've become aware of. Often it's coming out of Montreal, but Element AI is another. And I mean, I'm sure everyone has examples. I think it would matter in which particular sector, but yeah, you know what? Best answer is I think I should probably look into that more in terms of its relevance to you guys, and get back to you with something more helpful.
Next question is, for early stage use of AI, the initial challenges tend to center around getting more relevant data. How do you balance known bias in data sets due to available data versus benefits of even an early stage biased AI application can have?
Well, I mean, yeah, I understand it, but I don't know if this is allowed, but can David help clarify? Where's David?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about this
Yes.
for like our application. So in our company, we collect sleep data through wearables and then make basically fatigue predictions. So what we're trying to use AI for is taking an individual sleep data or group sleep data to try to predict sleep into the future. I'm thinking about this from the data we have currently. Our customers are very centered in Hispanic countries. So I would think like 75% of our data comes from that, but as the company grows, that's probably not going to be representative of, the population using our product in the future. So kind of when you're talking about the diversity aspect, I see our data set kind of skewed.
Right. And that's a function of, the what's feasible. I think part of what I'm saying is, as long as that is acknowledged, and at this point we have run our data mostly through these populations, and we are not asserting that it works for all other people as well. That I think is the most honest way to go about it, and actually, is I think probably happens to be useful in that it's probably true as well. So that's how I would answer that, is just being upfront about your practices. So not trying to hide the ball, but actually like this is as far as we got. And if someone has a recommendation for us to do it differently, we at least owned up to how we tried to fix it. We thought about it, and this is how we tried to go about it. What would be my
and I think it's a really interesting, we've talked about this, you and I did yesterday, is that there's something to people hiding or organizations hiding their efforts. And I'm just wondering, do you think that's helping or hurting, or the fact that companies they're trying things and maybe failing at them ethically? And is there a way that we can change that practice so that somehow we can move forward a little bit faster?
Yeah, well, that's, I mean, I think that's a really good question. Again, coming from a legal perspective, when some of these AI ethics proposals and teaching methods within companies have come about, and I've looked at it, the kinds of stuff that it would force people to acknowledge or admit, from the perspective of thinking about a lawsuit down the line, is a nightmare. And so it really is important how you go about asking. Are we? Did we get to the due diligence yet, or Douglas?
No, I was just going to ask you that one. Do you expect customers, either government or enterprise, to request AI due diligence before signing a contract?
I think there could be such a thing, but I think it would be it would be filled in by an intermediary. So I kind of think, like, I don't know what a due diligence would necessarily be, but I think a due diligence bot could also be, for example, a plugin on my browser that knows my preferences and then figures out and then tries to see the extent to which they map onto those terms that are being provided, and does that due diligence, for you in that sense. Again, it's hard to know how much to rely on it, but yes, I do think that. But I don't think the burden would be on the consumer. I think that they should be able to do that and have the capacity to do it, but the burden should be on the companies to disclose primarily. Burden should be on the government or third parties to audit and approve and authenticate. Um, because it is. I mean, it's too complicated for technologists to describe. We were talking about we mentioned part of this is the supply chain, how AI impacts the supply chain, and how the data travels from place to place. We haven't started thinking about it. I mean, in the privacy context and data protection more so, but not the way people have thought about other traditional goods and the supply chain. Imagine knowing that the data that you've received is tainted in one way or another, and you're stuck, and it may actually poison things down the line. Anyhow, there are different scenarios for that, but I think that the burden is on companies and government, but that yes, consumers should be able to know and have some mechanisms in which it is reasonable for them to quickly discern. For example, am I a bot or not? Let's start with that. To acknowledge that.
So Neil's got a question that I actually hear quite a bit when I say, people should be following best practices. And his question is, so their company is not expecting to run into ethical issues around management of data or training of data. So do you have some stories to share about AI tech startups who didn't expect to run into any major ethical issues with the development of their models or training of their data sets, but did anyway?
Yeah, I mean, there are reasons other than the personal data for it to be some of that comes under cybersecurity. The example that comes to mind, it isn't necessarily a startup, but in the IoT examples, I was working, one project was on cybersecurity, and I was reading about how the entire Ukrainian electric grid went down because of a backdoor hack, and so that's not anyone's personal data. All of that is computer to computer, but it is definitely vulnerable, and the ethical issues of having the utility agency having a blackout for a couple days is significant. So that has nothing to do with personally identifiable information. It's a cybersecurity example, and you'd have to think about that. I think I don't know if the extent to which it comes under ethical, but we all have to think about the origin of the data. I think it's I mentioned that I had once focused on teaching intellectual property. I think the ownership or control of data is something that you should think about. I think some of the ethical issues come about in regards to that, in regards to interoperability with other systems. Let's say, you may not think of it, but for this system to be able to work in a hospital or not, could depend on, could actually impact people's lives if it's not open and documented enough to enable the kind of customization for interoperability. That could be an ethical issue. So it's not just about personally identifiable information. In fact, I think some of the first examples when you asked, why we should be ethical, I was thinking of all those things that have to do, they're systemic. Me related to this complex network of the world, whether it be climate change and or and so anything that has to do with that kind of interconnectivity becomes an ethical issue. For example, in a time of global pandemic, there's all sorts of stuff you didn't think that was important that now apparently is that you need to do, and if you don't do it, it's sometimes it violates the law, but it's also like wrong. A lot of people assert and agree that the implication of being part of an interconnected thing and not doing your part or not taking care of it or not cleaning it well enough could have impacts throughout.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. Very engaging conversations. And everyone, thank you for the questions. Certainly a lot to think about as you're structuring your processes and how you really want to train your data in the next little while. I'm afraid that's all the time that we have today. I do want to thank you, Bethany and Eddan, for spending time with us. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your day. And those of you who are tuning in today and your questions as well. I am really looking forward to seeing all of you at the next sessions. In the meantime, if there are any questions, feel free to reach out to me directly. Again, thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.